In the 18th century BC, Anatolia was a land in chaos. Constant wars between the local city-states plunged the prosperous Bronze Age into a period of darkness. To survive, kingdoms had to become conquerors to avoid conquest by others. One group, known as the Hittites, were among the many caught in the turmoil. Along with the Hittites, another group inhabiting the region was a tribe of Indo-European speakers who probably arrived in Anatolia during the 3rd millennium BC. In the 17th century BC, this group conquered the Hittites, took their name, and assimilated their culture. These were the Hittites.
The Hittites were living in Anatolia when the Hittites arrived there to settle. The Hittites called their land the land of Hatti after the Hittites, and in fact Hittite itself derives from the name for this people.
The early years of the Hittite kingdom are shrouded by myth and legend. It's believed that around 1650 BC, the Hittite ruler managed to join all the disparate local people under his rule, establishing the Hittite kingdom. He then moved the capital of his new kingdom to Hattusha and took the name Hattushili, meaning man from Hattusha. Surrounded by the hostile Azawa tribes in the west and the formidable Hurrian and Mesopotamian states in the southeast, Hattushili knew that he had to assert himself in the region. He immediately went on the attack. In a short time, the Hittites conquered lands in eastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Any state that surrendered without fight was spared plunder and devastation. But any kind of resistance attracted the full fury of the Hittite army. Hattushili was a shrewd politician who knew that military success had to be backed by strong propaganda. As his conquests grew, he nurtured a superhuman image of himself.
His frame is new, his breast is new, his penis is new, his head is of tin, his teeth are those of a lion, his eyes are those of an eagle, and he sees like an eagle.
Hattusili I was a master of self-promotion. The texts that date to his reign testify to this side of his character. He was a self-proclaimed lion, and he did everything he could to try and live up to this epithet, both in his military conquests and in his handling of the tumultuous internal politics of the kingdom.
Under Hattushili's enigmatic, often ruthless rule, the young kingdom expanded. His military successes were forever embedded in Hittite folklore and annals. Hattushili spent most of his reign on military campaign. Once he secured the kingdom's borders, he set his sights beyond the Taurus mountains, towards the enticing resources and ports of Syria. Against the approaching Hittite army, the Syrian states formed a coalition under the city-state of Aleppo, the most powerful in northern Syria. Hattushili quickly conquered and plundered most of the North Syrian cities, and then attacked Aleppo. But 2 campaigns failed. Eventually, he abandoned all objectives in Syria and returned home. Hattushili's last campaign as a ruler had resulted in defeat. Around 1620 BC, Hattusili was ailing. On his deathbed, the aging monarch proclaimed his grandson, still only a child, as his legitimate successor. Hattusili's last words were engraved on the same tablet that Bedřich Hrozný would use to decipher the Hittite language 3,500 years later.
Laziamo Ari. Takaniatamo Sapa Andaharak. Nomo Takaniatamo Tatnats. Pasi.
This was a fragile time for the new kingdom. Their great leader was dead, and their borders were frail. Syria remained unconquered, and Hattusili's young grandson Murshili was on the throne. But by the time he was roughly 20, the youthful king was ready to complete his grandfather's unfinished business. Conquest of Aleppo had eluded Hattusili. After establishing control in Anatolia, Murshili marched to Syria and destroyed Aleppo. He then set his sights on a preeminent land to the southeast of Syria, Babylonia, the kingdom once ruled by the famous Hammurabi, the lawgiver. Around 1595 BC, Murshili and his army crossed the Euphrates, marched 600 miles and sacked Babylon. Murshili's victory put an end to the illustrious Babylonian Empire. Murshili's attitude towards the vanquished, such as the Syrians and the Babylonians, was the same as his grandfather's. If the enemy surrendered without a fight, they were spared devastation. But if they resisted, an example was made of them. Their land was torched and prisoners and booty were transported back to Hattusha. A new leader, usually a native who pledged allegiance to the Hittite king, was installed on the throne. The Hittites assimilated the rich cultures of the many lands they conquered. But the core of Hittite culture remained rooted with the indigenous Huttian people. Every aspect of life, from pottery to religion, revealed traces of the Huttians. In this period, Hittite artisans, such as potters and seal makers, labored to create artifacts with images depicting scenes ranging from rituals to marriages. Meticulously crafted seals with minute details contain the names of kings and queens. These seals were the very business cards of the Hittite royalty in international affairs. An official claiming to represent the Hittite ruler had to present his seal when asked.
The practice of using seals was very important, of course, in a largely illiterate society for general legal validation. And it's clear that most Hittites, down to quite lowly administrators, would have had one or more personal seals. The seals are mostly known to us from impressions on clay, on ceilings and on tablets. The royal seals were very fine and very beautiful. They would have the names written in hieroglyphic in the centre and in the cuneiform script around the outside, whereas the administrator's seals use only, as a rule, the hieroglyphic script. They also give us a great deal of information, both about the royal family, where queens often shared a seal with the kings, and also about the personnel of the administration.
The Hittites began depicting stories in their pottery almost 1,000 years before Western cultures. Hittite vases, with their strong narratives, remain the greatest visual source of information about Hittite society. The influence of Huttian culture was nowhere greater than in Hittite religion. Hittian gods and myths formed the foundation of Hittite theology.
The Hittites took a lot of things that we would consider natural phenomena and considered them manifestations of a particular god. So their religion, we would say, is polytheistic, and it was naturalistic. They had a high regard for the environment, the world around them, because it was sacred, because the gods themselves were a part of it. And their behavior, not only in the temples, but in daily life, had to reflect that same regard and reverence for all of life, which was to them religious.
Around 1590 BC, King Mursili returned home from a long and successful military campaign. The kingdom's prospects were promising, but one pivotal event changed everything. The assassination of Mursili by his brother-in-law plunged the kingdom into a period of chaos. For the next 65 years, most kings seized the throne by murdering their predecessors, and few were able to rule more than a few years. The kingdom was weak and divided. It seemed on the verge of collapse. By the time King Telepinu ascended the throne in 1525 BC, the kingdom had lost most of its territory to the west and the east. Immediately after his accession, rivals to the throne murdered his son and wife. Assassins were caught and scheduled for execution. But in an extraordinary demonstration of restraint, Telepinu did not execute the conspirators. Instead, he banished them from the land.
He witnessed the havoc that was wreaked in his kingdom in the previous generations by mutual reciprocal striving for the kingship and assassinating other people. And so when he came to the throne, his main concern in his reign was to stabilize the Hittite kingdom, to restore unity in the royal family, and to see to it that there was a regular form of royal succession in the future.
Let a prince, a son of the chief wife, become king. If there is no prince of the chief wife, let the son of a second wife become king. But if there is no prince, no heir, let them take a son-in-law, husband of a daughter of the first wife, and let him become king.
Telepinu recorded the rules of future royal succession in one of the most important documents in Hittite history. It has become known as Telepinu's Proclamation. The Telepinu Proclamation marked a new chapter in what was already a unique legal system in the Near East. Unlike his contemporaries, Hittite law was based on compensation rather than retribution. The laws, with their 200 provisions, covered many aspects of Hittite life, from marriage to agriculture. It was a dynamic legal code, evolving and undergoing reform as conditions changed and new cases arose.
One of the aspects of Hittite law that I find most fascinating, which is unique in the ancient world, is that they kept a record within the law itself of any changes that they made, any modifications. You might have a law that would run something like this. If a man breaks another man's foot, he used to pay 50 shekels, but now he pays 25 shekels.
any subject of the kingdom, or even of the vassal states in distant lands, could complain of injustice and obtain a fair ruling. The king's instructions to his governors and his family members were clear.
Into whatever city you return, summon forth all the people of the city. Whoever has a suit, decide it for him and satisfy him. Do not make the better case the worse, or the worse case the better. Do what is just.
The Hittite laws were the way the Hittite king implemented the desire of the sun god to protect weaker classes of people. And that is why I do not consider it a restrictive law in the bad sense, but rather restricting the extreme cruel treatment that could otherwise have been meted out to people who didn't have protection.
The laws were just, though the punishment for breaking them was often quite severe.
If someone contests the judgment of the king, his house will become a ruin. If someone contests the judgment of a dignitary, his head will be cut off.
Telepinu also took a new approach to foreign policy. He avoided protracted military campaigns and signed the first ever Hittite treaty with the land of Kizzuwatna. Other Hittite kings would adopt his strategy, and in time, Hittite treaties would become as effective as his military.
Treaties were very important to the Hittites. In a sense, they were the glue which held together the Hittite Empire. In fact, of all the treaties which have come down to us from the ancient Near East, more than half were found in the Hittite archives.
Telepinu stabilized the kingdom and established peace, even if it was only temporary. The growing military might of Egypt in the south and the new Hurrian state in the east, the kingdom of Mitanni, made future military conflicts inevitable. In time of war, the king could call up ordinary Hittite citizens to strengthen his army. The common people were the subjects of the king and servants of the gods. When the weather allowed travel, the farmers brought their goods to the Hittite marketplaces set up around the major cities and temples. There, they traded for commodities or crafts and paid taxes to the court. The Hittite marketplace was a bazaar, tax office, and stock market, all rolled into one. Cosmopolitan in many ways, these bustling marketplaces were filled with people, both local and foreign, combing the streets for merchandise. It was even a good place to meet your future spouse. All cases were brought for arbitration before the king's local governors, or the town's elders, who were under direct instructions from the king to exercise fairness. But more serious cases, such as sorcery, murder, or adultery, could be taken to only one place: the king's court at Hattusha. It was a marvel of engineering. A city literally carved out of rock. Its temples, houses, and the royal citadel stretched over an area of 400 acres, much larger than ancient Troy or Athens. Surrounded by imposing natural fortifications and miles of walls, it was considered impregnable. As the religious, economic, and administrative center of the land, it was one of the most important cities of the ancient world and the pride of the Hittites. Hattusha was the Hittite kingdom.
For them it was apparently no problem to shape rocks and cliffs in the way they wanted, and they put houses on almost every rock outcrop, every rock knoll you see here in the city.
An ordinary Hittite structure was erected on a stone foundation with sun-dried mud bricks strengthened by a timber frame. The roofs were made of beams covered with reed and plaster. The Hittites were masters of stone, sometimes shaping blocks weighing more than 15 tons. Special bronze tubes were used to drill holes in the stone for the wooden framework. In some walls, the stone masonry was so fine that it is still impossible to slip a sheet of paper between two stones.
Hittites were also able to shape and move huge blocks, especially the blocks you see at the city gates, but also blocks in the temples. For example, the largest block used in the big temple weighs about 40 tons. And they were able to shape them and to move them, most probably with sledges and also with big wooden beams, and moving them slowly, actually the same way as it was done in Mesopotamia and also in Egypt.
The Hittite engineers also designed a complex network of clay pipes that brought in water from the 7 springs surrounding the capital. The water was collected in artificial ponds and distributed to houses through neighborhood fountains. In an age when most societies lacked sanitation, many Hittite houses were fitted with a drainage system connected to sewer mains beneath the streets. The clay pipes had access holes for cleaning. Any damaged part could just be disconnected from the main system and quickly repaired. First and foremost, the Hittites were warriors, and their city was designed to make this clear to anyone who traveled to the capital. They surrounded Hattusha with massive stone walls that stretched for miles, with watchtowers and security tunnels located every 60 feet. The city could only be entered through 8 primary gates, which were heavily guarded and fortified. The gates could only be approached by steep ramps that were flanked by walls and 2 towers, one outside and one inside. In times of crisis, people living outside the city were brought inside for protection. So strict was Hittite security that after everyone had entered the city, the gates were closed and sealed by local officials every evening. The seals were checked first thing in the morning to determine if Hattusha had been infiltrated by the enemy or their spies. Most of the city's population were employed in temples, the religious and sometimes the administrative centers of the empire. The artisan workshops, the protective deity statues, and the official archives of the kingdom were all located there. Copies of all texts, ranging from treaties to prayers, were meticulously stored in the royal archives. A king could easily become familiar with past events and refer to his predecessors' exploits.
One of the strongest points of the Hittites is their enormous sense of history. The Hittites had a very strong conviction that the present is firmly rooted in the past, and that every decision you now take must be based.
It was 1400 BC, a century after the death of King Telepinu. The Hittite kingdom enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity, but it was not to last. Egypt formed a military alliance with the kingdom of Mitanni and invaded Hittite territory in Syria. Lands in the east became disobedient. Azawa states in the west rebelled. These attacks from 3 sides shook the kingdom to its very foundations, but they were nothing compared to the assault that the Hittites would face from the north. Were a group of northern tribes infamous for their defiance and ruthlessness. Capitalizing on the chaotic situation, they ravaged Hittite border towns in the north and pushed quickly south. Even Hattusha could not withstand the Kashgar onslaught. It was impossible for the Hittite army to defend all four fronts at the same time. In just a few years, the kingdom lost most of its possessions, retaining only a small piece of land in central Anatolia. The devastation was beyond the Hittites' worst nightmares, and their enemies were certain the kingdom was destroyed. The Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III summed it up in a letter to an ally.
I have heard that everything is finished, and the country Hattusha is paralyzed.
But they were all wrong. The Hittites would emerge from this defeat stronger than ever. One man would raise the kingdom from the ashes and transform it into a mighty empire. He would come to be known as the King of Kings, the greatest Hittite ruler in history. His name was Shupilulima. Shupilulima was raised to be a fighter. He was a battle-hardened soldier and a skilled politician who carefully planned his every move. When the kingdom of Mitanni and the Kashgar attacked, his father was king. Shupilulima was his chief advisor and comrade in arms.
The situation of the Hittite kingdom during the reign of Shupilulima's father was desperate. It was clear that the king did not control much more than the old heartlands of the Hittite Empire. The west had gone off, the north was difficult, the east, the south. And this is the situation in which Shupilulima, as a prince, came into the scene.
After the fall of Hattusha, Shupilulima and his father retreated to the provincial capital of Shamuha. There, he painstakingly rebuilt his army and set out to recapture lost territories one by one. Most of the lands were quickly reclaimed by the Hittites either by force or treaties. But as Hittite successes mounted, Shupilulima's father fell ill. On his deathbed, to the surprise of everyone, he passed over Shupilulima and appointed another son as his successor. Shupilulima was furious. He rebelled, seized the throne, and had his brother murdered. He violated Telepinu's proclamation of royal succession. As the new king, Shupilulima continued the campaign to rebuild the kingdom. After consolidating his position in Anatolia, he conquered the Azawa lands in the west and the Kashgar in the north. Hattusha was once again under Hittite rule. Shupilulima then marched south and crushed the powerful Syrian coalition. Within a year, most of the lands in northern Syria were under his rule. Of the enemies that had attacked the Hittites, only the kingdom of Mitanni remained unconquered. Shupilulima would not rest until payback was complete. In a relentless campaign, he attacked the Mitanni kingdom and subjugated all small states loyal to it. Shupilulima reinforced his military victories with political ones. He formed an alliance with the Syrian state of Ugarit. Ugarit's alliance would not only give the Hittites access to crucial trade routes, but would also provide a valuable source of tribute. The alliance proved to be a shrewd political move. Ugarit became the Hittites' most important source of revenue for the next 2 centuries. Although he was a skilled politician, Shupilulima's greatest asset was the Hittite military, the most powerful of its day. The military was made up of the infantry and the chariot units. The infantrymen were mostly armed with spears and shields. For close combat, they used bronze, sickle-shaped swords and axes. The Hittite military life was harsh and governed by strict discipline. The troops were expected to march long distances through difficult terrain and then fight the enemy. During some campaigns, they had to carry their weapons and shields for 900 miles under the fierce heat of the Anatolian sun. The elite unit and the pride of the Hittite army was the chariot force.
The chariot force was the most powerful weapon the Hittites had, charging into battle at the beginning and often ensuring victory before the battle had barely begun.
The Hittites did not invent the battle chariot, but they perfected it. In their hands, it became the equivalent of the modern-day tank. In most chariots of the day, the axle was located at the end of the cart, which carried 2 soldiers. The Hittites mounted the axle near the middle of the cart, making the chariot more stable and able to carry a larger load. This meant an extra soldier and more weapons, giving the Hittite chariots superiority in fire and manpower over their Egyptian or Hurrian counterparts. The Hittite charioteers could devastate the enemy by hurling spears and shooting arrows from a distance. They could then attack the enemy ranks and crush the fleeing soldiers by striking them from both sides of the chariot. The Hittite chariots were so feared that, according to the Old Testament, their thunder made the Syrians tremble with fear.
As far as Hittite military strategy in battle was concerned, the important thing was to try to get your enemy to meet you in open battle, because this is what the Hittite infantry were trained for. This is where the chariotry were most effective.
With his formidable military, Shupilulima was an unstoppable force in the Near East. Shupilulima wanted to extend Hittite influence to Mesopotamia by taking the daughter of the Babylonian king as his wife. This presented a problem, since he was already married, and his wife held the official title Tawananna, the Hittite queen. Shupilulima's solution that would enable him to marry the Babylonian princess was simple. He dismissed his wife, the mother of all his sons, from the capital and banished her into exile. Soon, the Babylonian princess traveled to Hattusha and married Shupilulima. She was now Tawananna, queen of the Hittites. After nearly 20 years of rule, Shupilulima had achieved dominance over the entire region. The Hittite lands stretched from the Black Sea in the north to the Euphrates in the east and the mountains of Lebanon in the south. The kingdom Shupilulima raised from the ruins had become an empire. Shupilulima still remembered the devastation his kingdom had endured under his enemies. One Mitannian stronghold remained before his revenge was complete: the city of Carchemish. In 1327 BC, Shupilulima besieged the city. As he waited for the city's surrender, a messenger brought a letter from Egypt. It was to mark the beginning of one of the greatest mysteries in ancient history.
My husband is dead, and I have no son. But it is said that you have many sons. If you could send me one of your sons, he could become my husband. On no account will I take one of my subjects and make him my husband. I am very afraid.
The author of the letter was the Egyptian queen Ankhesenamun. Her dead husband was none other than the boy king of Egypt, Tutankhamun.
Shupilulima must have been stunned. I mean, here is Egypt being given to him on a golden platter, a thing that he never dreamed of. And of course, that must have pricked the pride of some of the Egyptians, whether in ancient times or modern times.
Why would an Egyptian queen ask to marry a Hittite king's son? Why would she send a plea to her country's greatest rival? Suspicious that he was being deceived, Shupilulima dispatched his chamberlain to Egypt to meet with Ankhesenamun. Meanwhile, he captured Carchemish and returned home for the winter. The following spring, Shupilulima's chamberlain returned with an angry letter from Ankhesenamun.
Why did you say they deceived me? Had I a son, would I have written about my own and my country's shame to a foreign land? I have written to no other country. Only to you I have written. They say you have many sons, so give me one of yours. To me, he will be husband. In Egypt, he will be king.
It was almost too good to be true. A Hittite prince would sit on the Egyptian throne, and the Hittites would become the greatest power of the known world. Persuaded, Shupilulima sent his son to Egypt to marry Ankhesenamun. Anxiously awaited the news of his son's safe arrival in Egypt. But none came. Finally, after a few weeks, a messenger brought him a letter. The prince was dead. He had been murdered by Ankhesenamun's rivals the moment he entered Egyptian territory.
Siones, qui quid hier? مصري
Shupilulima brought back many prisoners to Hattusha, but this would have terrible consequences for the Hittite Empire. The captives carried with them a dreadful plague. The disease spread rapidly, decimating the population. The Hittite lands were devastated.
We have no idea of the nature of the plague beyond the fact that it was brought to Hatti by Egyptian prisoners of war. But there's absolutely no doubt about the desolation, devastation it caused in the Hittite land, carrying off large numbers of the population and virtually reducing the kingdom to the brink of starvation.
As the Hittites prepared for a major conflict with the Egyptians, terrible news came from Hattusha. In 1322 BC, the 22nd year of his reign, King Shupilulima died from the plague. Following Hittite funerary rituals, the king's body was borne in state for cremation, enabling the king to complete his journey to the afterlife. Among the mourners at the funeral was the king's Babylonian wife. She would retain her status as queen in the next reign. The plague carried off Shupilulima's successor immediately after his accession. The empire had now lost 2 rulers in a single year. Power now rested on the shoulders of Shupilulima's youngest son. Moshili II inherited the most powerful, but also the most vulnerable empire in the Near East.